Why everything is getting more expensive. Everyone has a theory about why your grocery bill is destroying you. Some people blame greedy corporations. Some blame Biden. Some blame Trump. Some blame supply chains. And some blame a vague shadowy force called the economy, as if it's a sentient creature that decided one day to personally ruin your lunch budget. And here's the thing. All of those explanations have a sliver of truth in them, but none of them are the full story. And none of them explain why inflation doesn't just arrive once and leave. Why prices go up and rarely come all the way back down. Why your salary can increase and somehow your life still feels more expensive than it did 3 years ago. Because the real explanation doesn't start with corporations or politicians. It starts with something far more fundamental. Something that's been quietly happening in the background for decades. And it's something most people have never been taught to think about. It starts with what money actually is. And more importantly, what happens when there's suddenly a lot more of it. Let's rewind to February 2020. The world is normal, boring even. And then a global pandemic shows up uninvited and the entire economy locks down almost overnight. Businesses close. Unemployment spikes. People stop spending. And the government faces a choice. Let the economy collapse. Or do something drastic. They chose drastic. The Federal Reserve, which is America's central bank, slashed interest rates to near zero. And then the government did something it had never done at this scale before. It started sending money directly to people. Stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment benefits, PPP loans to businesses. And to fund all of this, the government borrowed. And the Fed helped absorb that borrowing by expanding its balance sheet from roughly $4 trillion to nearly $9 trillion in 2 years. And this is where most people's understanding of inflation stops. They know the government printed money. They know prices went up. They assume those two things are connected and move on. But the actual mechanism, the reason why printing money causes prices to rise, is something almost nobody explains properly. So let's fix that. Meet Sarah. Sarah runs a small bakery. She makes 100 loaves of bread per day. Each loaf sells for $3. The total value of her daily output is $300. And the total amount of money in her town that could theoretically buy that bread is also roughly $300. Supply meets demand. Prices stay stable. Now imagine the government drops a helicopter over her town and doubles the amount of money everyone has overnight. Now there's $600 in the town chasing the same 100 loaves of bread Sarah still makes every day. Sarah's bread didn't change. Her costs didn't change. But suddenly everyone has more money and they all want bread. And Sarah, being a rational human being, raises her prices. Because she can. Because demand has outrun supply. That is inflation. In its most basic form. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. And that is exactly what happened between 2020 and 2022. The M2 money supply, which is the broadest measure of money circulating in the American economy, grew by approximately 27% between 2020 and 2021. That is the largest jump in the money supply in modern American history. Larger than anything seen during the 2008 financial crisis. Larger than anything seen during the inflation of the 1970s and 80s. And roughly 18 months after that money flooded the system, right on schedule, just as economists who study monetary history would have predicted, inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022. The highest in 40 years. It wasn't a mystery. It was math. But here's where it gets more complicated and more interesting, because the money supply story explains the 2021 and 2022 spike. It doesn't fully explain why in April 2026, after the Fed raised rates aggressively, after inflation came down from 9% to around 2 to 3%, prices are still elevated. Why your grocery bill is still higher than it was in 2019. Why the number on the receipt still stings even though everyone keeps telling you inflation is under control. The answer is that inflation and price levels are two completely different things. And the media almost never explains the difference. Inflation is the rate at which prices are rising. Price level is where prices actually sit. When inflation falls from 9% to 3%, that doesn't mean prices dropped 6%. It means prices are still rising, just more slowly. The only way prices actually fall is deflation. And deflation is so economically dangerous. It causes consumers to stop spending because everything will be cheaper tomorrow, that central banks actively try to prevent it. So when the government said inflation is cooling down, what they actually meant was the rate of price increase is slowing. Not that your eggs are getting cheaper. The prices you're paying today are baked in. They're the new floor. And the new inflation is being stacked on top of that floor. That's why everything still feels expensive. Because it is. And it's supposed to stay that way. But there's a third layer to this. And it's the one nobody on television is talking about. In March 2026, inflation jumped back up to 3.3%. The highest reading since May 2024. And the culprit this time isn't money printing. It's energy. Gasoline prices surged 21.2% in a single month. Energy overall spiked 10.9%. And this is directly tied to rising geopolitical tensions in the Middle East affecting global oil supply. And this brings us to the second engine of inflation that operates completely independently of monetary policy. Supply shocks. When the supply of something critical like oil, which is embedded in the cost of producing and transporting almost everything you buy, gets disrupted, prices rise regardless of what the Federal Reserve does. The Fed can raise rates all it wants. But raising rates doesn't drill more oil. It doesn't fix a broken supply chain. It doesn't rebuild a factory that shut down during a pandemic. Supply shocks and monetary expansion are the two engines of inflation. And they can operate simultaneously, which is exactly what happened between 2021 and 2022. You had the largest monetary expansion in American history colliding with a global supply chain crisis triggered by COVID lockdowns and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine driving energy prices higher. Both engines firing at the same time. The result was the most aggressive inflation environment in a generation. And then there's the part that corporations don't want you to focus on. Because here's something the data shows that doesn't get enough attention. During the inflationary period of 2021 and 2022, corporate profit margins actually expanded, meaning companies didn't just pass their higher costs on to consumers. Many of them used inflation as cover to raise prices beyond what their cost increases actually justified and pocketed the difference. Economists have a name for this: greedflation. And while it's a contested term in academic circles, the data is hard to argue with. S&P 500 profit margins hit record highs during a period when American consumers were being crushed by rising prices. The inflation created by money printing and supply shocks gave companies a permission structure to raise prices. And many of them raised prices more than necessary, not because they had to, but because they could. So what does all of this actually mean for you? It means three things. First, understand that inflation is not random. It is almost always the downstream consequence of policy decisions made years earlier. The stimulus of 2020 and 2021 was a choice. A defensible choice given the circumstances of a global pandemic. But a choice with predictable consequences that arrived right on schedule. Second, understand that lower inflation does not mean lower prices. It means prices are rising more slowly. The price level is permanent. Plan your finances around what things actually cost today, not around some memory of what they cost in 2019. Third, understand that the next wave of inflation is already visible if you know where to look. Energy prices are rising again. Tariffs introduced in 2025 are pushing up the cost of imported goods. And the M2 money supply is currently sitting at over $22 trillion. More than double what it was a decade ago. The system has more dollars in it than at any point in American history. Any supply shock or policy decision that further disrupts the supply of goods could light the inflationary fuse all over again. And that's why this matters. Not because it's interesting economic theory, but because the decisions being made in Washington and in central banks right now are going to determine what you pay for groceries, rent, and gas in 2027 and 2028. Most people are watching the wrong scoreboard. They're watching the inflation headline number and sighing in relief when it falls. But the real question was never what is the rate of price increase. The real question is what is the purchasing power of your dollar going to be 5 years from now? And if history is any guide, the answer is less than it is today. That's not doom and gloom. It's just math. And it's exactly why understanding how money works is the most important financial skill nobody taught you in school. Because the real threat to your financial future was never a stock market crash. It wasn't a recession. It's the slow, invisible, completely legal process of your purchasing power being quietly eroded year after year. And that's why I made this channel. Because the stuff that actually impacts your life is never the stuff making the loudest noise. Hit subscribe if you want to keep seeing the things hiding in plain sight.